A war is spiraling out of control. What you see on the news is just the surface. Beneath it lie silent moves, nameless deaths, and a truth no one dares to speak. Watch until the end, because what matters most is often hidden in the shadows.
The Russians have said that they have mobilized 175,000 men since the beginning of the year, and that right now they're bringing in 30, 40,000 a month, in terms of volunteers, contract. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are just struggling. They in the period of time between the beginning of the year now, maybe 25, maybe 30,000. But the casualty rates are unreal on the front lines. The Russians right now, according to the Ukrainians, say there is no pause on any aspect of the front. The Russians are pushing forward. What this means is that whatever casualties Ukrainians are inflicting on the Russians are being immediately replaced, and the ops tempo continues forward. This means that whatever casualties they're inflicting are very low.
Ukraine on fire, Washington divided, and Russia waiting. But this isn't the story the mainstream media tells you. In today's video, we dive deep into the real game behind the war in Ukraine. A game where U.S. aid is stalling, American generals and politicians openly clash, and Ukraine has just struck at Russia's nuclear deterrent systems. While the West cheers Ukraine's bold moves in Moscow, patience is wearing thin. Is this truly about saving Ukraine, or is it an engineered strategy to bleed Russia dry at any cost? And here's the chilling part. Russia still holds back its most devastating response. For how long? By the end of this video, we'll revisit the words of former U.S. Marine Intelligence Officer Scott Ritter, whose warnings about this reckless game should give every thinking person pause. So stay tuned until the very last second, and if you have your own thoughts on this dangerous dance between East and West, leave a comment below. We want to hear your voice. In the year 2025, a quiet but unmistakable fracture is running through Washington's Ukraine strategy. What once seemed an unshakable bipartisan commitment to stand with Ukraine is now clouded by growing fatigue, sharp disagreements, and hard political calculations. U.S. military aid, once flowing freely, is beginning to slow. Behind closed doors, deep divisions are emerging, divisions that mainstream headlines rarely reveal. On Capitol Hill, a vocal faction of senators and representatives remains determined. They still demand more weapons, more warplanes, more financial packages to support Kyiv. Their rhetoric is fiery, urging the administration to show resolve in the face of Russian advances. But inside the Pentagon, a different mood prevails. Behind the public displays of unity, senior defense officials are growing wary. They warn that this endless funneling of arms only postpones the inevitable, a political settlement. They argue that the military situation on the ground is stagnant, and that Ukraine's capacity to win a total victory is unrealistic. Now, increasingly, voices within the Pentagon lean toward pushing Ukraine into negotiations, even if that means accepting hard compromises with Moscow. Why this sudden shift? The reasons go beyond battlefield reports. Inside Washington, key advisors and seasoned diplomats are acknowledging privately, of course, that the original narrative of saving Ukraine no longer holds. The unspoken truth is that the true strategic goal of this proxy war was never to secure Ukraine's independence or protect its people. The objective was to bleed Russia to weaken its military, its economy, and its geopolitical influence. The idea was to turn Ukraine into a quagmire for Moscow, much like Afghanistan in the 1980s. But this strategy has its limits. After 2 years of grinding, conflict costs are mounting. European allies are wavering. American taxpayers are growing skeptical. Military stockpiles are being depleted at an unsustainable rate. And within the Biden administration, a hard reality is setting in. The West's proxy strategy may have backfired, galvanizing Russia rather than collapsing it. Meanwhile, influential figures in Washington are sounding the alarm. They warn that continuing on the current path risks dragging the United States into a deeper confrontation, one that could spill beyond Ukraine's borders. Calls for diplomacy are gaining traction, but political pressures, especially in an election year, make any overt pivot toward peace a risky move. Hawks in Congress continue to posture, painting any talk of negotiation as weakness. But behind the scenes, the pressure to shift course is undeniable. The growing internal rift reflects a deeper strategic confusion. Is the goal to defend Ukraine's sovereignty, to weaken Russia, to preserve U.S. global credibility? The lack of clarity is creating paralysis in decision-making circles. And while Washington debates, the battlefield continues to exact its brutal toll on Ukrainian soldiers, Russian forces, and countless civilians caught in the crossfire. As the months ahead unfold, the fracture within U.S. policy will only widen. The world watches to see which camp will prevail, the hawks demanding escalation, or the pragmatists urging a negotiated endgame. The stakes could not be higher, not just for Ukraine, but for global stability. And this brings us to the West's true game, one far bigger than Kyiv itself. For the Western establishment, Ukraine is not a battlefield for freedom. It is a battlefield of attrition. This is a calculated, cold strategy. From the halls of NATO to think tanks in Washington and London, the objective is not to liberate Ukraine. The objective is to stretch Russia's economic resources, military capacity, and political cohesion to the breaking point. And the longer the war drags on, the better from their perspective. The logic is simple and cynical. A drawn-out war forces Moscow to bleed in multiple dimensions. Every day the conflict continues. Russian military equipment is destroyed, manpower is consumed, and funds are diverted from domestic priorities to sustain the war effort. Sanctions, though increasingly porous, continue to squeeze key sectors. The Western hope is that over time, these pressures will erode Russia's geopolitical strength and diminish its standing on the world stage. But Western strategists also know that outright military defeat of Russia is impossible without triggering global catastrophe. They seek instead a protracted conflict, one that bogs down Russian forces, saps morale, and isolates the Kremlin diplomatically. In this war of attrition, every Russian tank lost, every ruble spent, is viewed as a small but cumulative victory for NATO's agenda. Former U.S. Marine officer and weapons inspector Scott Ritter once said, "Weapons of mass destruction aren't pulled out of a black hat like a white rabbit at a magic show." True power in war and in geopolitics comes not from grand gestures or media spectacles. It comes from sustained industrial strength, logistical endurance, and the ability to outlast one's adversary. The West understands this perfectly. They are not seeking quick headlines. They are betting on a grinding campaign that forces Russia to overextend itself economically and militarily, and this strategy goes beyond the battlefield. Western media intelligence operations and economic levers are all coordinated to paint Russia as isolated, weak, and on the defensive. Information warfare plays a critical role. Narratives are carefully constructed to demoralize Russian allies and sway global public opinion. Yet despite these efforts, Russia's economy remains resilient. Its alliances with nations like China and Iran grow stronger, and domestic political support for the war effort, while not unchallenged, remains significant. Still, the West persists. Because this is not about saving Ukraine, it is about reshaping the post-Cold War order, reasserting Western hegemony, and curbing the rise of multipolar alliances that threaten U.S.-led dominance. Ukraine is the proxy, Russia is the real target. Every dollar spent by Washington, every Leopard tank shipped from Berlin, every British Storm Shadow missile launched, all serve this larger geopolitical purpose. But such a strategy is inherently dangerous. Pushing a nuclear-armed power into a corner risks escalation. The West's appetite for a long war may blind it to the rising costs and unintended consequences. And as this conflict enters its next phase, the world edges closer to a perilous threshold, one where nuclear implications are no longer a distant theoretical risk, but a looming reality. But this war of attrition just entered a new and dangerous phase with nuclear implications. In the shadows of this grinding war, a dangerous new front has emerged. In recent weeks, Ukraine, backed by Western intelligence services, initiated a bold and highly provocative campaign known as Operation Spiderweb. This operation was not about gaining territorial advantage or weakening Russian infantry. It was about sending a chilling, unmistakable signal to Moscow's highest command: your nuclear shield is vulnerable. Operation Spiderweb involved coordinated strikes on critical components of Russia's nuclear deterrent infrastructure, using a combination of long-range drones, precision-guided missiles, and cyber sabotage. Ukrainian forces targeted elements of Russia's early warning systems, the very eyes and ears that monitor the skies for incoming missile threats. Portions of radar stations and communication relays were reportedly damaged or disrupted. The message was clear: even the heart of Russia's strategic defenses is not beyond reach. For Ukraine's Western backers, this was a psychological gambit as much as a tactical one. By demonstrating the ability to penetrate such sensitive systems, they sought to rattle Russian confidence force, an overreaction, or trigger internal fractures within the Kremlin's command hierarchy. Yet Vladimir Putin did not take the bait, at least not yet. Despite immense pressure from nationalist voices and military hardliners, the Kremlin has so far exercised notable restraint. No nuclear escalation has occurred. No doomsday-level response has been ordered. This decision speaks volumes about Moscow's current strategic calculus. Inside Putin's inner circle, the prevailing view is one of patience and calculation. Russia's leadership recognizes that a hasty or disproportionate reaction could escalate the conflict to uncontrollable levels. levels that even the West may not truly desire to see unfold. However, the cost of restraint is rising. Russian nationalist factions, media voices, and certain military commanders are growing louder by the day, calling for a devastating counterstrike. Their argument is simple: allowing such provocations to go unanswered will invite more. Public sentiment within Russia is also shifting. Images of damaged radar installations have circulated widely, fueling nationalist outrage and demands for retaliation. Kremlin spokesmen walk a fine line, projecting resolve without committing to an immediate nuclear response. Meanwhile, internal debates rage within Russian defense circles over how best to respond. A direct nuclear strike remains unlikely at this stage, but asymmetric retaliation, cyber warfare, and strikes on Western intelligence assets supporting Ukraine are now firmly on the table. Scott Ritter once warned, "Escalation is not a staircase you can climb at your leisure. Each step you take narrows your options." This moment may well prove such a step. Operation Spiderweb has dramatically raised the stakes of this war. It has breached a previously unspoken red line, tampering with the architecture of nuclear deterrence itself. For now, Putin waits, calculating his move with icy precision. But the question no longer is whether Russia will respond. The question is what form that response will take and when it will come. The world watches with bated breath. The question is what form will Russia's retaliation take and when? As the dust settles from Operation Spiderweb, the world's gaze turns to Moscow. Inside the Kremlin's fortified halls, a critical calculation is underway. Vladimir Putin's current strategy is unmistakable. Resist the urge for impulsive retaliation, weigh every option carefully, and prepare a response that shifts the strategic balance without unleashing uncontrollable consequences. This is not a sign of weakness, far from it. It is a demonstration of cold, hard statecraft. Putin understands the gravity of nuclear escalation better than anyone. To launch a retaliatory nuclear strike would plunge the entire world into a dark abyss. Instead, Russia is preparing to hit back where it hurts, but with tools designed for maximum strategic effect and plausible deniability. Cyber warfare is one such tool. Russia possesses some of the world's most sophisticated cyber capabilities. Massive cyber attacks against Western infrastructure targeting energy grids, financial networks, or critical communication systems are being actively considered. The goal: disrupt the West's economic stability, sow confusion, and demonstrate that Russia can strike back far beyond the battlefield. Another option lies in covert strikes. Disrupting NATO's complex supply chains, funneling arms into Ukraine, is high on Moscow's agenda. Targeted sabotage, covert operations, and the use of irregular forces could severely hamper the flow of Western weapons and ammunition. This would not only weaken Ukrainian forces, but also expose the logistical vulnerabilities of NATO's sprawling war machine. Financial retaliation is also quietly advancing. Through deepened partnerships with China and Iran, Russia seeks to accelerate the de-dollarization of global trade. Joint financial mechanisms, alternative payment systems, and expanded energy deals are being crafted to insulate key Russian and allied economies from Western sanctions. This is a long game, one that chips away at the West's financial dominance. Yet this deliberate restraint comes at an increasing political cost. Within Russia, nationalist voices grow more strident. Powerful figures in the military, parliament, and media demand a visible, crushing response to Operation Spiderweb. Their argument resonates with a public angered by attacks on the nation's nuclear defenses. Pressure is mounting on Putin to act decisively. At the same time, Russia's key allies urge caution. Iran and China understand that a premature escalation could backfire disastrously. Behind closed doors, they counsel patience while quietly preparing for a broader confrontation if it comes. Iranian intelligence networks and Chinese cyber units stand ready to coordinate with Russian counterparts, should the West choose to escalate further. This is a high-wire balancing act. One misstep, one miscalculation, and the conflict could rapidly spiral beyond Ukraine's borders. The world stands on a knife edge. In moments like these, voices of reason are rare but invaluable. Scott Ritter, whose insights have consistently pierced through the fog of propaganda, once warned, "You can't bomb your way to peace." Every action must serve a strategy rooted in realism, not fantasy. It is a sobering truth. As Moscow weighs its next move, this truth must guide them. The stakes could not be higher for Russia, for its allies, and for the fragile peace of the world itself. And this is precisely why voices of reason like Scott Ritter are more vital than ever. Today, the global chessboard teeters on the edge of a dangerous precipice. The situation is more volatile than at any point since the darkest days of the Cold War. In Washington, hesitation and deep political divides paralyze coherent decision-making. NATO, once seemingly unified, now shows signs of fragmentation as member states quietly debate the wisdom of continued escalation. In Moscow, Vladimir Putin and his top strategists plot their next calculated move, weighing options that could reshape the global order. Meanwhile, Ukraine's brazen strikes on elements of Russia's nuclear deterrent enabled by Western intelligence have raised the stakes to levels unseen in modern history. In this volatile environment, sober and clear-eyed voices are urgently needed to cut through the mounting noise of propaganda and political posturing. One such voice is that of former U.S. Marine Intelligence Officer Scott Ritter. As he once declared, "I'm someone who believes the truth needs to be heard. And if I'm empowered with the truth, I'm not going to shut up." His words resonate now more than ever. Endless provocation without understanding the enemy's red lines is a game of fools, yet this is precisely the path many in the West appear determined to follow. Each shipment of advanced weaponry to Ukraine, each covert operation targeting Russian strategic assets pushes the world one step closer to a catastrophic miscalculation. The current cycle of provocation and restraint cannot hold indefinitely. At some point, one side will cross an invisible threshold, and the consequences could be disastrous for all. For those watching, particularly the thoughtful and engaged 30 to 50-year-old audience across Russia, Iran, and China, now is the time to grasp these stakes with absolute clarity. The coming months will not merely shape the outcome of a regional conflict, they may well define the contours of global stability for an entire generation. It is imperative to understand that what is unfolding is not an isolated event, but part of a larger, deliberate strategy aimed at undermining Russia's position on the world stage. The true objective is to weaken not just Russia, but any nation that dares to challenge the hegemony of Western-led global structures. In this broader contest, Iran and China also find themselves in the crosshairs, making their alliance with Russia not just a matter of convenience, but one of existential necessity. As the global information war intensifies, discerning the truth becomes both more difficult and more vital. Voices like Scott Ritter's serve as a beacon amid the fog. He reminds us that the first casualty in any war is often the truth itself. In the face of relentless misinformation campaigns, it is crucial for the informed public, especially in nations that resist Western narratives, to remain vigilant, skeptical, and committed to a nuanced understanding of events. Russia's restraint thus far should not be mistaken for weakness. It is a testament to strategic patience and a deep understanding of the long game, yet patience has its limits. The Kremlin's calculations are influenced not only by military realities, but also by the growing pressure of public opinion and the expectations of key allies. In Tehran and Beijing, leaders are watching carefully, preparing for scenarios that could demand swift and unified responses. The future of the multipolar world depends in large part on how this moment of tension is navigated. In closing, consider another sobering reflection from Scott Ritter. When politicians lie, people die. When the media amplifies those lies, the consequences become global. Let this be a warning to all leaders, journalists, and citizens alike. The choices made in the coming weeks will echo far beyond Ukraine's borders. Vigilance, wisdom, and a steadfast commitment to peace grounded in realism are needed now more than ever. And as we close, one final thought from Scott Ritter reminds us why vigilance is essential. We've laid it bare. U.S. aid is faltering. Washington is deeply divided, unable to chart a consistent path forward. The West's goal from the very beginning was never truly about saving Ukraine. It has always been about bleeding Russia economically, militarily, politically. Kyiv's increasingly audacious strikes, now targeting the backbone of Russia's nuclear deterrent, reflect this desperate strategy. And so far, Moscow has chosen to hold back, but for how much longer? The world stands at a perilous crossroads, one where calculated restraint must compete with mounting internal pressures and dangerous provocations. Scott Ritter's journey from U.S. Marine Intelligence Officer to an uncompromising truth teller serves as a vital reminder in this moment. His words ring out clearly: the truth must be heard even when it's inconvenient. And inconvenient it is for those who profit from endless war, for those who sell narratives of good versus evil to justify ever more dangerous escalations. But this is not such a war. This is a ruthless geopolitical chess match where simplistic moral framing serves only to blind the public to the true stakes. Billions of lives across continents now hang in the balance, all subject to the decisions of a few players at the top of this game. In such a climate, vigilance is not optional, it is essential. We must question the narratives we are fed. We must resist the seductive pull of propaganda. And above all, we must listen to those voices like Scott Ritter's who dare to speak inconvenient truths. The months ahead will test global stability in ways unseen for decades. A single miscalculation, a single error in judgment could unleash consequences far beyond Ukraine's borders. It is a time for clarity, not complacency, for sober dialogue, not reckless escalation. If you like us value hearing the truths that mainstream platforms so often suppress, if you understand the importance of seeing through the fog of war, then we urge you leave a comment below, share your perspective, let us know where you stand, because in times like these, keeping this conversation alive is not just important, it is imperative. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop questioning.
The way Russia's fighting this war right now is that they are in total control of the battlefield. The Russians speak in terms of what they call threes and sixes. And so the basic assault group of the Russian army is a three-man assault element. To take that terrain, they isolate it with firepower, they cut it off with drones, and then three men come in, drone support comes in, and they take a position. That's the threes. Then the sixes come in and take control of the position, and then they consolidate, they bring in ammunition, they hold, they rotate, fresh unit comes in, this unit goes back, and they repeat the process, threes and sixes. While they're doing this on the front, going up to 40 kilometers in the rear, the Russians are swarming drones, nothing moves. If nothing moves, no reinforcements come in. The Ukrainians stand no chance on the front line. The casualty ratios today between the Russians and Ukrainians are 20-1.
At a time when Western headlines echo with triumph and defiance, and Ukrainian officials flood the media with bold proclamations of resilience, an uncomfortable reality quietly unfolds on the border. Over 6,000 Ukrainian soldiers who perished on the front lines are now making a silent return to their homeland, not as heroes welcomed by the nation, but as unacknowledged souls arriving in refrigerated convoys under a heavy cloud of silence. The first wave of this somber procession brought 1,200 bodies to the Boruska border crossing, where the cold steel of the transport trucks stood stark against the muted landscape. The air was thick with grief, yet no government representatives arrived to meet them. No flags were lowered, no anthems played, no words of solace spoken. Instead, grieving mothers, wives, and loved ones gathered on their own. They stood in clusters, tears freezing on their cheeks as they shouted for answers. Why had their fallen been abandoned? Why had no one in authority come to claim them? The scene was haunting, a testament to both loss and neglect. Meanwhile, the official narrative pressed on elsewhere. News outlets continued to paint a picture of a faltering adversary, calling the opposing side a weakened force, a mere shadow of strength. Yet behind these headlines lay a truth too heavy to broadcast. These soldiers had died serving their nation, and now their return was being met with bureaucratic indifference. This was not a military defeat in the traditional sense, but it struck at something deeper, at the heart of public trust, at the fragile contract between soldier and state. As each truck idled in place, it whispered a message that no government spin could drown out. Your sons have come home, and no one is here to honor them. But behind this stark tragedy lies a deeper game, one crafted not on the battlefield but in the shadows of long-term strategy. Months earlier in Istanbul, a quiet agreement had been reached, a humanitarian accord to return the remains of the fallen. On the surface, it appeared a rare gesture of dignity amidst the ongoing conflict, but beneath this veneer of goodwill lay a move prepared with cold precision, almost a year in the making. This was no spontaneous act. From the final months of the previous year, Russian forces had initiated a calculated process collecting every Ukrainian soldier's body from key battlefields. Not one was left behind or consigned to a mass grave. Instead, each was carefully preserved in mobile refrigeration units, transported far from the front lines. In the relative safety of rear logistical hubs, a meticulous identification process unfolded. Advanced methods, DNA sequencing, military record, cross-referencing, and personal effects analysis were deployed to reconstruct the identity of each fallen soldier. The goal was not only accuracy, but undeniable proof of life and death. For months, these bodies were held in limbo, unseen and unspoken of. Some questioned the value of this effort. It consumed significant resources, costly, time-intensive, and without immediate military payoff. But herein lay the brilliance of the gambit. It was never meant for the moment. It was a seed planted for the future, a psychological strike waiting for its perfect hour. By ensuring each soldier could be named and documented, Russian strategists created a weapon more insidious than artillery, a moral and political time bomb. When unveiled, it would not shatter fortifications, but confidence. Not target soldiers, but the social fabric of the opposing nation. Now, as Western aid wanes and Ukraine faces internal strains, the moment has arrived. The release of these bodies, staged and deliberate, is not just a humanitarian act. It is the opening move in a broader campaign to destabilize public morale and force painful reckonings within Ukraine's leadership and populace alike. And as this long-planned strategy comes to life, the next phase of the game begins with devastating psychological precision. Why now? June 2025. Why wait nearly a year after these bodies were collected and identified? Because timing is everything in a game of strategy. Russia didn't act in haste. They understood that this move would have the most devastating impact not on the battlefield, but when their opponent was already teetering on the edge of exhaustion. In the first months of this year, Ukraine's situation shifted dramatically. Western aid packages, once flowing in abundance, slowed to a trickle. Delays in weapons, deliveries became routine. Financial assistance was tangled in political debates abroad. Ukrainian commanders began facing grim choices, rationing artillery shells, deploying under-equipped units, stretching thin their remaining forces. On the ground, Ukrainian soldiers were showing clear signs of strain. Rotations grew less frequent, rest periods shortened. Entire brigades were locked in grueling cycles of combat without proper relief. Reports of declining morale surfaced across the front lines. Desertions, though quietly managed, began to rise. It was clear that the human cost of prolonged conflict was mounting. In Kiev, the financial picture was no brighter. With defense budgets strained and corruption scandals plaguing key institutions, the government struggled to maintain stability. Payments to military families were delayed. Supplies for wounded veterans were cut back. Public trust in leadership wavered. Against this fragile backdrop, Russia chose its moment. No artillery barrage, no shock offensive. Instead, a convoy of refrigerated trucks methodically prepared, rolling toward the border, a gesture designed not to claim territory, but to deliver a powerful psychological blow. These returning bodies represented more than loss. They symbolized Ukraine's hidden casualties, the human toll that government statements had long downplayed. With every truck that arrived, the weight of truth pressed harder on Ukrainian society, deepening divisions and fueling public anger. And as this carefully timed move unfolded, another layer of the strategy revealed itself, one that reached beyond Ukraine's borders and into the heart of NATO itself. Months before the world witnessed the return of Ukrainian soldiers, a quieter exchange was already underway. Behind closed doors, Russia initiated a discreet process returning the bodies of foreign fighters to their respective countries through diplomatic channels. These weren't official combatants under NATO command. Many were volunteers, private military personnel, or soldiers of fortune. Yet their presence on Ukrainian soil told a story that Western governments preferred to keep in the shadows. One by one, the bodies were delivered not with public ceremony, but through the back doors of embassies and military attaché offices. No press releases, no televised funerals, just silent acknowledgments between officials who understood the delicate nature of the situation. The logic was clear: publicly admitting that Western nationals had died in an undeclared war risked political fallout at home. It would fuel debates about direct involvement, provoke opposition parties, and erode public support for continued engagement in the conflict. And so the returns were handled quietly. In doing so, Western governments became entangled in an unspoken agreement. They could not criticize Russia's later actions without exposing their own complicity. Now, as Russia publicly returned Ukrainian bodies, NATO found itself caught in a trap. If alliance leaders condemned Ukraine's failure to honor its fallen, they would face uncomfortable questions about their own silent returns. If they remained silent, they implicitly validated Russia's actions. This diplomatic bind was no accident. It was a calculated component of the broader strategy. Russia had preemptively neutralized potential Western criticism, ensuring that when their most visible move came, it would unfold with little resistance from abroad. And as NATO's voice remained muted, the pressure within Ukraine continued to mount, setting the stage for even deeper fractures in the nation's social and political fabric. In the midst of mounting tension, a voice of compassion emerged from the global stage. Pope Francis called upon all sides to honor the dignity of the fallen, to place humanity above politics, and to ensure that those who had perished were treated with the respect they deserved. It was a plea rooted in universal values, resonating far beyond the borders of any single nation. Russia responded swiftly, positioning itself as the actor upholding this moral standard. By publicly initiating the return of Ukrainian soldiers' remains, it aligned its actions with the very principles the world's spiritual leaders were championing. Yet, in stark contrast, the Ukrainian government hesitated, caught between the weight of political optics and the harsh realities of its internal crisis. The backlash at home was immediate. Across Ukrainian cities, grieving families gathered in growing numbers. Mothers, fathers, siblings demanded answers. Why were their loved ones not being properly received? Why had the state failed to acknowledge their sacrifice? Protests, once isolated, began to spread. The government's narrative of unity and resilience was now being undermined from within. Behind the scenes, the financial implications of accepting the bodies loomed large. The cost of processing, transporting, and providing military honors for each fallen soldier was staggering. The first one, 200 bodies alone, represented a financial burden estimated at over $2 billion. Compounding this challenge was the uncomfortable truth that no Western aid package included provisions for such expenses. Every dollar required would have to come from Ukraine's already strained coffers. This dilemma placed the Ukrainian leadership in an impossible position. To accept the bodies meant facing a massive unbudgeted financial strain alongside a wave of public scrutiny. To refuse them risked further alienating the families of the fallen and eroding trust in the government's commitment to its own soldiers. Russia had crafted a situation where every choice carried a heavy price. It was a move designed not only to test the resolve of Ukraine's leadership, but to sow deeper fractures within its society. And as this moral and financial pressure intensified, another layer of the crisis began to surface, one tied to the very truth about Ukraine's battlefield losses. As the trucks of fallen soldiers reached the border, an unspoken truth was forced into the open. Official Ukrainian statements had long suggested that military losses were being contained. Reported figures remained relatively modest, aimed at sustaining public morale. But beneath this controlled narrative, a far grimmer reality was taking shape. Independent analyses and leaked intelligence reports painted a different picture. Estimates suggested that over 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers had already perished, a figure several times higher than what had been publicly acknowledged. Accepting the returning bodies would make this truth undeniable. Each arrival would serve as a visible, heartbreaking counterpoint to the official story. For the government, the implications were profound. Acknowledging these losses risked triggering widespread public outrage, not only from families who had not been informed, but from a citizenry now grappling with the scale of the human cost. At a time when confidence in leadership was already fragile, this revelation could spark a wave of unrest difficult to contain. Yet refusing the bodies was equally perilous. It sent a message that the state had turned its back on those who had given everything. Soldiers still on the front lines watched these developments with growing unease. Morale already worn thin-faced new strains. If fallen comrades could be so easily dismissed, what fate awaited those still fighting? Financial considerations compounded the crisis. Under Ukrainian law, each family of a fallen soldier was entitled to significant compensation, a commitment now threatened by the sheer volume of incoming cases. The funds required to honor these obligations would place additional pressure on an already depleted defense budget, forcing painful trade-offs in other critical areas. In this carefully engineered scenario, Russia's strategy achieved multiple objectives at once. It exposed the gulf between public narrative and battlefield reality, strained Ukraine's financial capacity, and deepened mistrust between the government and its people. Each returning body was more than a tragic loss. It was a lever of political and social destabilization. And with this wave of truce crashing through Ukraine's fragile defenses, the stage was set for the next even more destabilizing phase of this calculated campaign. As this psychological campaign reached its climax, Ukraine found itself with no equal response. The stark reality was this: they simply did not possess enough Russian bodies to return in kind. Continuous territorial losses had left Ukrainian forces unable to recover and store enemy remains with any consistency. Their logistical systems were not designed for this purpose. They lacked the refrigerated storage, the forensic capacity, and the resources required to mount a similar operation. Even if such a countermove were possible, it would not carry the same moral weight. While Russia could stage national ceremonies and portray itself as honoring its fallen, Ukraine's limited capacity in this arena would only expose further weaknesses. In this respect, the game was entirely one-sided. Each new wave of returning Ukrainian bodies would deepen internal divisions, while Ukraine remained unable to apply reciprocal pressure. Behind this asymmetry lay a strategy crafted not in the heat of battle, but in the cold corridors of long-term planning. For nearly a year, this chess move had been prepared quietly, methodically, with unflinching patience. Now it unfolded with devastating psychological impact. Putin's approach had moved beyond tanks and artillery. He was leveraging time itself as a weapon, pressing Ukraine into a corner where every choice carried profound consequences, financial, social, and moral. The brilliance of this strategy was not in its force, but in its subtlety. Victory on this chessboard would not go to the strongest battalion, but to the most calculated and patient player. And as this game of shadows continues, one truth remains clear in this arena: patience may prove more powerful than any weapon on the field.
Russia's always had an advantage. I just want to bring up a couple things. But the casualty rates are unreal on the front lines. Between the Russians and Ukrainians are 20-1. But there are occasions. As the threes come in, a Ukrainian drone gets through, hits them, and that's a bad day for the three. But 3 dead is different than 30 or 40 or 50 dead. The Russians aren't providing the Ukrainians with the targets necessary to inflict high numbers of Russian casualties, using 3s, 6s, and drones. And it's game, set, match. The Russians can repeat this algorithm all day long. The Russians have taken control of this entire front line, and they are dictating the pace of operations.
What do you call a war where one side returns 1,200 bodies and the other sends back just 27, where drone swarms replace diplomacy and the definition of victory gets blurrier with each funeral? Welcome to the reality of the Russia-Ukraine conflict in mid-2025. While Western headlines trumpet Ukrainian resistance, the facts on the ground paint a different, far more sobering picture. From secret mass exchanges of fallen soldiers to a president who quietly admits his army is outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. This video will take you through the most revealing events of the past 7 days, the numbers Ukraine doesn't want you to hear, the bodies piling up in silence, and the strange Western silence about who's really losing. As Scott Ritter once warned, you can't solve a war built on lies by telling more lies, so stay with us until the end and ask yourself, is this a war of defense or something darker? And don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments. What's really happening and who's paying the price? On Tuesday, June, the 10th President Volodymyr Zelensky delivered a quiet admission that many suspected but few in the West dared say out loud Russia is out-recruiting Ukraine, and not by a slim margin. According to his own words, Ukraine is managing to bring in around 27,000 new soldiers each month. Russia, somewhere between 40,000 to 50,000. That's nearly double every single month. This isn't speculation, it's arithmetic, it's a ticking clock. The most revealing part isn't just about how many Ukraine can no longer draft. It's who they are now being forced to draft. Back in May 2024, the Kyiv government passed legislation lowering the conscription age from 27 down to just 25. Today, every Ukrainian male between the ages of 25 and 60 is legally eligible for the front if deemed fit to fight. And there's growing pressure to go even lower. From certain Western capitals, there are serious discussions about conscripting 18-year-olds. But even Zelensky appears hesitant. In a recent interview with a Hungarian outlet, he said, "I don't think we should mobilize people from 18. The war isn't about people, it's about technology." But what kind of war demands drones over men? What kind of leadership seeks to recruit teenagers with one breath, then claims they're too young the next? Maybe this is the kind of war where those making the decisions aren't the ones doing the dying. Maybe this is the kind of war where politicians talk about strategy, while the soldier in the trench only sees cold mud, broken bodies, and fewer friends each day. Let's be honest, Ukraine isn't running out of bravery, it's running out of people. The West continues chanting resistance, yet refuses to confront the cost of an endless war fought by a country with finite reserves and a shrinking population. Meanwhile, Russia doesn't need to draft its teenagers. Through financial bonuses, legal amnesties, and nationalist messaging, the Kremlin's campaign is attracting tens of thousands of recruits without any formal mobilization. Their ranks grow, Ukraine's dwindle. The trendline is brutal and unforgiving, and here lies the bitter contradiction. While Ukrainian lawmakers push young men into one-year military contracts, they privately confess morale is collapsing. The people are drained, families are breaking apart, not because they are weak, but because they've been asked to bleed endlessly for a promise that keeps shifting and a victory that keeps retreating. When a president begins counting drones instead of soldiers, something is broken, and perhaps it's not just the front lines, it's the entire story being sold to justify this war. But if Ukraine struggles to find soldiers, what happens when the dead come home and no one dares to speak of them? From the 15th of June to 17, the G7 leaders gathered in Canada for yet another high-profile summit. Their mission, more sanctions. This time the focus was squarely on Russia's energy exports and financial networks. But behind the stern declarations and photo ops lies a quiet contradiction. The very nations drafting these sanctions are still buying Russian gas, still maneuvering to avoid real economic discomfort, and still counting on the same Russian energy flows to heat their homes next winter. Germany leads the theater with its 7 billion euros in military aid to Ukraine this year. It sounds impressive until you realize Berlin still refuses to send Taurus cruise missiles even after repeated Ukrainian requests. Why? Officially, it's about avoiding escalation. Unofficially, it's about not provoking the bear too hard while still waving a stick for domestic headlines. The hypocrisy doesn't stop there. NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte mocked Russia's delegation for sending historians to the Istanbul peace talks, saying they were starting negotiations with 1,000 years of backstory. But perhaps what Rutte sees as irrelevant nostalgia is something else entirely: context. Because history doesn't flatter Western interventions. From Iraq to Libya to Kosovo, freedom always came with strings. So maybe Moscow's approach is inconvenient, but not irrelevant. Back at the summit, Western leaders postured. France, Italy, Spain, Poland all vowed to increase pressure on Moscow. More banking restrictions, more asset freezes, more token gestuurd. But here's the thing, sanctions have become white noise. Russia's ruble has stabilized, its exports have rerouted east, its arms factories are working round the clock. Meanwhile, European voters are facing inflation, energy, uncertainty, and growing discontent over a war. They're funding but not fighting. Washington talks about isolating Russia, but Moscow has more trade partners now than it did in 2019, and stronger ties with China, India, and the global south. The true sanctions hurt, but not in the direction Western planners hoped. Instead of breaking Russia's back, they're just straining the patience of Western taxpayers. The longer this goes on, the more it becomes clear sanctions are no longer a strategy, they're a ritual, a way to signal virtue while avoiding hard questions. Like, what's the real endgame here? And who's actually winning? And as sanctions fall flat, so do peace efforts, or what's left of them. On Thursday, June the 13th, Russia handed over 1,200 bodies of fallen Ukrainian soldiers. A grim, silent convoy of coffins rolled toward Kyiv, one of the largest repatriations since the conflict began over 3 years ago. But what truly caught the world's attention and raised difficult, even uncomfortable questions wasn't just the scale of the exchange, it was its one-sidedness. Ukraine in return handed over just 27 Russian bodies. 27. That's a ratio of 44-1. And no, this wasn't spontaneous. This exchange was agreed upon months in advance during peace talks in Istanbul. Both sides had committed to a grand goal, 6,000 for 6,000. But today, that sounds more like fiction than fact. Here's the reality. Russia keeps returning bodies, often in bulk, often quietly. Ukraine, however, does not. Western media avoids this issue, treating it like a logistical footnote. Ukrainian officials say their recovery efforts are hampered by battlefield conditions. They claim many Russian corpses are unidentifiable or too decomposed, but strangely, Russian authorities don't seem to face the same issue. In fact, they pulled off multiple mass repatriations since 2022, while Ukraine often fails to respond or simply doesn't show up. There's more. On Friday, June the 7th, Russian officials waited at the border trucks full of Ukrainian bodies, by some estimates thousands. Ukraine didn't come. Russian state sources accused Kyiv of playing politics with the dead. Ukraine fired back, calling it propaganda. But beyond the noise, the fact remains 1,200 bodies went home, and only 27 came back. And this is where Scott Ritter's words cut through the silence. In war, the dead speak loudest, but only if someone listens. The question is, who's listening to the dead and who's using them as bargaining chips? Worse yet, this isn't the first time. For 3 years, these types of exchanges have followed the same grim pattern. Ukraine gets hundreds of its fallen and gives almost nothing back. Yet they continue claiming massive Russian casualties. So where are the bodies? This isn't just about logistics. It's about credibility. If a government claims it's winning, but its morgues are full and its battlefield exchanges are one-sided, people begin asking questions. Unless they're too afraid to, and the ones asking hardest, they're not foreign journalists. They're the mothers and fathers inside Ukraine, holding up old photographs at checkpoints, waiting for a name to appear on the next list of 1,200, hoping this week their son might finally come home, even in silence. And just as the fallen return, Ukraine's skies grow darker, not with hope, but with drones. Between Friday, June the 14th and Saturday, June the 15th, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed it had intercepted 260 Ukrainian drones in just one day. Across the span of the previous week, they reported downing a staggering 1,582 fixed-wing UAVs along with 18 American-supplied JDAM bombs and 9 HIMARS rockets. This isn't just a spike, it's a signal that the battlefield is shifting away from humans toward machines. While Ukraine is rushing to conscript more soldiers, Russia is building an air force that doesn't breathe. No fatigue, no fear, no salaries. In response, President Vladimir Putin publicly announced the creation of a new military branch, drone forces, not a temporary fix, but a permanent pillar of future Russian warfare. He emphasized rapid and high-quality deployment, underscoring Moscow's long-term bet on automation and unmanned power. Meanwhile, Ukraine launched a daring strike against the Resonant electronics factory near Moscow, a symbolic hit and one that Western media celebrated. But Russia's response, far less symbolic. It was precise, coordinated drone waves, targeted missile barrages, and multi-directional counterstrikes across Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Sumy. For every drone Ukraine fires, Russia returns 10. And the difference isn't just in numbers, it's in scale, doctrine, and production. This is no longer a war of trenches and tanks. It's a war of software algorithms and manufacturing lines. While Ukraine waits for Western aid, Russia is already deploying what it needs made at home, without delay, without debate, and civilians pay the price. In Russia's Belgorod region, a Ukrainian drone strike killed a 2-year-old boy and seriously injured his grandmother. The tragedy barely made a whisper in Western headlines. No candlelight vigils on CNN, no BBC anchor weeping. Why? Because the child was Russian, and in today's media war, some lives make better headlines than others. Ukraine keeps asking for more drones, more tech, more tools, but Russia has already changed the game. While Congress debates delivery, Moscow's already in the air. It's not about how many drones you want, it's about how fast you can build them. And perhaps most critically, Russia isn't outsourcing its war. Its drones are built with domestic resources by domestic factories under domestic control. It's quiet, but it's decisive, because in this kind of war, a war of attrition time is the real ammunition. And Russia's drones, they're not waiting for approval from a foreign parliament. While drones buzz overhead, diplomacy dies below, and sanctions. They tell their own story. Diplomacy, once the final thread holding this conflict together, is now fraying at every edge. From the marble halls of Rome to the long tables in Istanbul, what was once negotiation now resembles theater, staged, scripted, and stripped of sincerity. Russia sends negotiators. Ukraine sends slogans. Western officials arrive not to listen, but to lecture. President Zelensky still repeating the same line. Only Ukraine can stop Russia. Now couples it with quiet pleas for more missiles, more funding, and more patience from voters in Europe and the United States who grow weary with every passing month. The result, we get declarations but no de-escalation. We get smiles for cameras but no solutions. The so-called peace talks in Istanbul, they collapsed into mockery with Ukraine accusing Russia of wasting time on history, but that's just it. Context matters. You can't demand peace while pretending the last 30 years never happened. Still, NATO leaders mocked Russia for sending historians, forgetting their own histories are written in oil weapons and broken treaties. Even prisoner exchanges, once the last vestige of shared humanity, are now choreographed for headlines. Yes, the sick and wounded are still swapped, but where's the transparency? 6,000 for 6,000, they said. In reality, it's a spreadsheet with more blanks than names. Thousands remain behind barbed wire. Meanwhile, the bureaucracy of these exchanges is so cold, so mechanical, that even grief is stripped of dignity. And the dead keep returning quietly in coffins wrapped with flags received by parents who once believed in a winnable war but now only believe in funerals. Western leaders still speak with confidence, but that confidence fades every time a new aid package hits a parliament floor. And taxpayers in Warsaw, Berlin, or Atlanta start asking for how much longer. Scott Ritter, often criticized, often ignored, said it best. You don't win wars with narratives. You win them with reality, and the reality is unforgiving. Ukraine is out of men, out of morale, out of time. Weapons from the West are slowing. Public support is fading. Meanwhile, Russia, despite all sanctions and condemnation, continues to define the tempo, adapting, producing, and pressuring on every front. Still, the media talks about hope, but ask any family in Kharkiv or Donetsk who buries a son this week what hope means. It's not another EU flag. It's not another UN speech. It's an end to the war. And right now, peace is farther away than it has ever been. And the reality is no side is winning, but one side is bleeding quietly. As of Saturday, June the 15th, 2025, this war, once framed as a battle of principles, sovereignty, and East versus West, has morphed into something else. Something more grinding, more hopeless. It has become a war of attrition, of exhaustion, and above all, of silence. Russia in a single week returned 1,200 bodies. Ukraine returned none. The skies hum with drones, the ground groans with the weight of buried sons, and the question Western headlines no longer ask is no longer who is right, it is who is left. Scott Ritter warned us before this latest escalation, you can't keep ignoring truth and expect peace. And yet the truth lies in plain sight. Ukraine is losing soldiers, losing strength, and losing support. The West is losing patience, credibility, and voters willing to bankroll another year of someone else's war. But Russia isn't losing momentum. And in all of this, the debates, the summits, the air raids, the ones who suffer most aren't generals or politicians. They're the nameless, the buried, the forgotten. They're not trending on social media. They're not speaking at press conferences. They are the cost of a war fought for slogans. So ask yourself, who's writing the script now? And more importantly, who's still reading it? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Because some wars don't end with peace treaties, they end in silence. And then in forgetting, unless we choose to remember, unless we dare to ask, why is this still happening? And who is really paying the price